Alright, next up on the roster of reviews is our first natural ultra rare in the game, Shinano. Now, she's not here. Nice. I told her to be here so that we can do this. Well, I mean, I know where she is. Alright. I'm gonna have to go wake her up. Hey. You good? Hey. Didn't sleep too well last night, now did you? Well, I'm kind of impressed. I didn't even notice until we got to the dorms here. You do know you sleepwalk, right? No? Huh. Well, anyway, we're here, so let's go wake her up, alright? Then we can get back to what we need to do. Alright, now with that little bit handled, let's dive into our first buildable ultra rare, IJN Shinano. Shinano joins our ultra rare ranks alongside Worstbite and San Diego. However, she didn't need a retrofit to reach this rarity, as she was obtainable for build during Dreamwaker's butterfly event. And man, that was something. First character with an actual pity mechanic, even if the pity was 200 builds a copy. Anyway, the Rainbow rarity is known for the sheer power the ships within that rarity have. Does Shinano hold to that expectation, or is she too busy sleeping to be of much use? Well, let's find out. Looking into her survival side stats, we can see that she has a huge health pool for a backliner, passing up almost every single carrier and even coming close to tying some of the Ironblood's battleships. She'll definitely be able to withstand some serious damage and keep pushing through it. Now, taking from the Yamato class, her heavy armor allows her to be a lot tankier and handle AP shots from battleships a little bit better than her medium armor carrier counterparts. Not all carriers have heavy armor, so it should be noted that while they do fare a bit better for most attacks, they will still suffer worse from torpedo-based attacks. Now, evasion-wise, she's more likely to be hit than her medium armor counterparts, but I'd honestly say that evasion is about middle of the road if we consider all backliners here. Regardless, don't expect too much dodging from her. Lastly, her anti-air is in an interesting position. It's barely lower than most of the Sakura Empire carriers, but it does keep up with them for the most part. She may not be as effective as some of her counterparts, but the overall difference is kinda negligible, especially when you consider the damage received side of anti-air and Shinano's massive health pool. At the end of the day, the floof is definitely thick and will be able to outlast many of her counterparts. As for her offensive stat line, Shinano definitely has a noticeable difference in aviation compared to her SR counterparts. She'll be able to dish out more damage from her planes than most carriers. What was definitely surprising is the reload stat. I've generally known the heavy carriers to lag behind the medium armors in terms of reload, which really just means that they're going to be a bit slower at releasing their planes.
指揮官、怒りますわよ。いくらよしよししたって機嫌は治りませんからね。
No, Formidable, I'm not saying this to poke fun at you. I'm just making a point. Even then, it's not much of a point considering how little reload plays to airplane timers anyway. But it is interesting to see her take on a more medium armor reload stat than following the usual trend from the heavy armor carriers. What this does mean though, is that she'll perform at roughly the same speed as her medium armor counterparts instead. So better damage output, way better health, and attacks about as fast as normal carriers. She's off to a good start for her with the stats alone. But let's see how her kit fares as well. Now, I generally say it's important to consider the loadout of your carriers. Not all of them are created the same, and I mean this when it comes to both the type of planes that they use and how many of each plane they get. Shinano is no exception to this rule either. By default, Shinano starts with the standard trio setup of fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo bomber. However, after her first limit break, her fighter slot can be swapped out for whatever plane you'd like to put there instead. Want more dive bombers? Slap a Helldiver there. Want to remind Taiho that Albacore isn't the only one with torpedoes? Equip that Barracuda or a Ryusei there. Just remember that whatever plane you do use there will have an efficiency of 125%, so dive bombers and torpedo bombers won't be as effective as those coming from their native slots that have 130% and 140% respectively. Now, if we were to compare those efficiencies, both the fighter and dive bomber seem to be at roughly the norm for those plane types. As for her torpedo bomber, this efficiency of 140% is towards the higher end of the spectrum. This just means that her overall damage output would be about the same as other carriers, but thanks to her higher aviation stat, she'll be able to deal a bit more damage in the end. Overall, despite being in the heavy armor carrier archetype, Shinano manages to compete against her medium armor counterparts while maintaining the benefits she gets from the heavy armor archetype as well. Her stat line seems to take on aspects of both together to really give her that extra power. When we view her stat line at a level 120, we do see some pretty decent jumps to a lot of her stats. Her HP boost makes her rival the thickness levels of Bismarck, though with her appearance in the Slow Ahead anime, I think Shinano's got some catching up to do. Her evasion nearly doubles, giving her a bit better survival chance, and the nice bumps to aviation, anti-air, reload, and even hit will help her in combat. Overall, she's got a pretty solid stat line and kit to work with. However, her skills could make or break her, so let's dive into those three. Shinano's red skill is Hope's Tempest, which does two major things. The first is really after 3 seconds of fighting, a Sayun Recon plane is released by her. We'll get more into that in a second as the second part of this skill brings the importance of that into it. Upon releasing any airstrike she has in the future, she launches an additional airstrike consisting of either Shidenkai 2 fighters, Ryusei torpedo bombers, or Sayuns. Sayuns are different from the other planes as they do not attack, but instead they do debuff a random enemy. This debuff lowers their firepower, torpedo, and anti-air stat by 3%, and increases the damage they take by 3% as well. These debuffs affect one enemy at a time, lasts indefinitely or until the character is defeated, and stacks up to 3 times. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, that Sayun at the beginning of the fight, after the 3-second mark, that one also debuffs an enemy at combat start. Now, this debuff is really nice, even if it doesn't do much until it really starts stacking. The only major thing to consider is that if an enemy is a standard mob, that debuff will disappear once they're defeated. Now, I will say it does seem to prioritize an enemy that already has a debuff instead of being completely random, but I haven't been able to fully confirm that, so take that as you will. Nonetheless, this skill is a great enabler for dishing out damage faster and allowing other ships to chip in as well. On to her next skill, Dreamwaker's Bow. This is definitely a very interesting skill as well. The first bit of it is that every 15 seconds it fires a special barrage. While not particularly crazy damage-wise, it's pretty hard to miss it as it's that colorful group of butterflies that appear on the screen. It still can do some damage, and you all know how I feel about anything that is basically free damage. However, there is another major part of this skill which has 2 branching conditions. The first condition being that the fleet Shinano is in, she will get up to 15% more aviation for her first 2 fights. The second condition is for the fleet that she is not in, or the other fleet you bring into combat. There is a slight typo when it comes to this particular skill description, and what it actually is supposed to be is that on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Battle of the Sortie, the second fleet, after 15 seconds, will get a barrage from Shinano, not an airstrike. That's something that's very important to mention here because the skill is a bit misleading on that. So, come on devs. I had to do a double take on this when I saw it in the recording, and then I looked at it in the actual skill description. Now, there is an Operation Siren addendum to this, which really just states that the counter resets upon moving to a new area or changing your formation, but that's really all there is to the skill. I'm sure a lot of you are already kind of seeing the suggestion this skill is trying to, this skill is trying to give towards her in the boss fleet. I'm just wanting to make sure everyone knows that this bit is well known. Lastly, her blue skill, Protector of the New Moon, also has multiple parts to it. Jeez, devs, you guys are really making skill descriptions into essays at this time. Anyway, the first part gives destroyers up to a 15% buff to their firepower, evasion, and anti-sub warfare stats while she's standing. What's interesting about this particular part is that there's two things, really. The first being that it doesn't buff their torpedo stat, which was something I was certain to be part of the course for Sakura Empire, but then the second part is that it's not faction specific. So you could use this with literally any of our gun destroyers at this point. Be a pretty decent buff for them, to be honest. Now, the second part of this skill requires 3 or more Sakura Empire ships in her fleet, and I'm talking the one that she's in. If that condition is met, then Shinano gets a 20% damage reduction from both main guns and aircraft, and gives an aviation and accuracy, or hit, buff of 15% to all Sakura Empire carriers. The damage reduction is nice, especially when you consider her health pool, but that still leaves her torpedo weakness unaddressed, so make sure to take precautions about that particular part. The aviation buff towards all Sakura Empire carriers is nice, and especially crazy for Shinano if you consider the fact that her yellow skill is also giving her an aviation boost. And let me remind you that Nagato also buffs the damage output of carriers. When you put all this together, well,
that's a lot of damage!
So a strong stat line, skills that make her and her allies stronger, skills that weaken enemies, and skills that support the fleet that she's not in, she's doing a whole lot of things, which makes it really hard not to feel her presence in combat. Overall, she's quite a scary powerhouse that can not only hit pretty hard, but also help her teammates to really pitch in as well. Of course, the next question is whether or not we're looking into a mob or boss fleet backliner, and while yes, she can work in the mob fleet, well, as I mentioned earlier, they are really pushing her to be a boss fleet backliner. Her skills really give off that suggestion, so I think it's important to acknowledge that bit. Now, she will require 2 other Sakura Empire ships with her to get the most out of her. I did already mention Nagato being a good buddy to bring alongside her, but there are still a good number of other ships that can work, even in the Vanguard. Destroyers like Kitakaze and Suzutsuki could easily satisfy this requirement while still benefiting from Shinano's blue skill. If the rest of the group isn't from the Sakura Empire, they'll at least still benefit from some of Shinano's skills, as she's still a decent team player. In the end, Shinano's a solid ship in general to use who could shine with or without her Sakura Empire teammates. Definitely worth the investment if you've got her for sure, as I'd be surprised if she's not one of the best carriers we've got. Now, I know some of you aren't really into using the meta, so for those of you, touch extra floofy tails. And that'll be all for this video. Hope you enjoyed, and that it will help you in your future endeavors. Up next is Portland, so look forward to her video when it comes out. Now, whether you're a regular viewer or a patron supporting the channel on Patreon, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Has anyone seen Yamashiro, Fubuki, or Tanikaze? What do you mean they're asleep? Come on, Sandy, we gotta go find them.
を一石たりともかけることなく連れ帰ってみせる。